For a long while we just stood there, looking down at the profound and fleshless grin. The body had apparently once lain in the attitude of an embrace, but now the long sleep that outlasts love, that conquers even the grimace of love, had cuckolded him. What was left of him, rotted beneath what was left of the nightshirt, had become inextricable from the bed in which he lay, and upon him, and upon the pillow beside him, lay that even coating of the patient and biting dust. This is the No Fear Podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 21 in season 3, and we are kicking off the summer with some news of the weird. That's right. We're talking preserved corpses. So the introduction that Matt read for us is an excerpt from the short story A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner. I will go ahead and say that we are about to spoil this story for you guys. So if you did not pay attention in English class in high school, you may want to pause the podcast and read the story real quick. Otherwise, we're going to continue on with this Faulkner story. I have to say, A Rose for Emily might be my favorite short story of his.
Yeah, it's up there for me as well.
I mean, it's probably one of his most highly anthologized ones, right? And with good reason, I would say.
Well, I mean, students love it. And let's just go ahead and lay it out for our listeners. The basic premise is there is an older, wealthier woman who lives in this small town in Mississippi. And all the townspeople kind of gossip about her because at one point she almost got married and was very kind of scandalously left at the altar, or her marriage never lasted. But everybody thought the house was kind of strange, and she was the old spinster woman, so it wasn't quite a haunted house story, but you can see the Rose for Emily is almost like the beginnings of what would become a haunted house story, because people are already talking about Emily's house and how she kind of lives up there all alone, and they just kind of watch her become this old reclusive woman, who everybody in the town kind of wonders about, and for good reason, because as it turns out, as the section that Matt read for us indicates, she's not alone in the house. In fact, she has murdered her lover, who was going to leave her all those years ago, and has been shall we say, sharing the marriage bed with his body for the remainder of the decades that followed. So there's the nice, it's one of the best endings because, and I cut it off at this intro, but that intro is when the people come in following Emily's death. And, they walk into the house for the first time, or people haven't stepped foot in this house for so long, and they see the body of her lover in the bed. And then right next to it, there's another pillow with an indent as if a head's been lying there and one long gray hair. I'm kind of, leaving that to your imagination of what's been going on there. It's a really creepy story, and it's, I don't know, it's surprisingly a fun story to read, I think. I don't know.
Well, and the disappearance of her lover is not the centerpiece of the story until the end. I mean, her just being a weird recluse is kind of because it's all the townspeople talking about that weird old lady who lives by herself kind of thing, and then you kind of get bits and pieces of like they give you the clues as to what happened, but it doesn't really all come together until the end. It's really well written.
Yeah, he really gets the voice of the townspeople like spot on. How they make all these uh, kind of comments about her and they gossip about her. She goes out too much when she's with Homer Barron. She doesn't go out enough at other times. They don't like the fact that she has the one, servant person, working in her house. She's too much like a lady. She's not a lady. I mean, it's complete, Faulkner's really getting this kind of, and not just a Southern community, but small towns everywhere, and how they pick out certain people who may or may not be eccentric and kind of have these gossiping moments about them. I mean, they even say that they went to the funeral not really because they cared about her, but because they were so fascinated by her oddity. And the like you said, Matt, everything about the guy's disappearance is kind of in the background. Even when there's a section where his dead body is making people uncomfortable, the smell is dealt with kind of in the background as people just show up and throw lime around her house and go on because they don't want to kind of disturb her. Um, and there's also the class thing going on too. Like her father was friends with higher ups in town back in the day, and she doesn't have to pay taxes, and she kind of has this silent fight with the townspeople, especially the newer generation that doesn't get her and thinks she's weird. So I Faulkner just gets it right on the nose how these different people would interact with each other and what they would think about her. It's only kind of at the end when it comes to your attention that she is in some ways as strange as they said she was.
Right. Well, everybody just kind of assumes her lover left town. And they have no reason to believe otherwise. But I do love, Mel, what you were talking about with this idea too of um, class issues kind of working and gender roles, I think, to some degree, because I think that was part of it too, is they just didn't believe a woman capable of something like that. Um, and also, man, yeah, the smell. There's a whole section devoted to the smell and how the townspeople deal with it, like you talked about, and that's almost given more description than the actual time her I don't know if her fiance, her lover, whoever he is, I can't remember his name now, but that the section where he's actually alive and in the story is maybe only a few sentences, and it seems like the smell is given much more of a lingering description, um, which should be a big tip off both to the reader and to the townspeople. But that just goes to show you what money will do, that they're like, oh, well, number one, we don't want to make her mad. Well, she's powerful. She's from a rich family. Like she could do no harm. Um, and maybe they should have been paying more attention to what was happening behind the doors.
Well, there's also, part of the reason she is the way she is to a certain extent is because of the treatment that she received at her father's hand and the class issue. Because she wanted to be married, like that was what she wanted. So we're not talking about like a woman who chose to be alone, but the townspeople note that nobody in town was good enough for her, and that her father turned away everyone who ever came to have a relationship with her. And so her escape from the father, who is, I think, described at least once, maybe twice, as guarding her with a horsewhip, to get out of that is to get married, and she wants to get married, and he doesn't allow her. And like the first time she hangs on to a corpse is when the father dies, and she won't give him up for like 3 or 4 days. And I think in some ways Faulkner kind of, with light sketches, shows us this woman in this really kind of disturbed home life where she's held apart as like nobody's good enough for you. You can't be friends with anybody. You can't court anybody. You can't marry anybody. You must just take care of me because you're the person left. And it's not excusing what she does, but Faulkner with just a few little strokes of his pen or his typewriter gives us a picture of what her life must have been like before this.
Well, it goes into that kind of insular, I mean, almost kind of cultish mentality that we've talked about in previous episodes, especially around these, and this isn't a haunted house story, but it could be. It reads like that to me in a lot of ways, especially the way the townspeople treat her. But um, it it fits with that. You know, we've talked about, of course, We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, and it even reminds me of the women living in the house in The Little Stranger. You know, where this kind of, when you're part of an upper class where you feel like you are above everybody else, it is very isolating. And what do you do then? You've got to cling to whatever you have, which is usually just a big old empty house, as everybody sort of slowly dies around you, which is, I mean, that's kind of the extended metaphor that I think Faulkner is going for in A Rose for Emily. But he, like you said, he does it really well. I can see why this one is taught in classes a lot. Plus the fact that it's really fun for teachers when we assign this story and it's obvious students have not read it, because you get to a certain point in your lecture and everybody gasps. They're like, what? They start furiously like turning pages.
Yeah, that is pretty. That's always a fun.
Yeah, I mean.
When she did what? Oh, well, maybe we need to have a pop quiz now.
Right. Yeah, pop quiz next week. Yeah.
It's always that story, or like Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, that I always teach just to see how many students are actually reading before class.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know if you guys know this, but, well, for our listeners, we may have mentioned this a few times. So Matt, Mel, and myself met when we were in Oxford, Mississippi. And of course, that's where William Faulkner lived and wrote a lot of his works. And there is actually a house that is still standing in Oxford, not too far from the little downtown square area, that Faulkner based this story on, like the house in this story on. And in fact, he may have lived there for a few years when he was first married. And that's why he kind of settled on that house. But you can still go and kind of take walking tours and see. If you ask just about anybody who's lived in Oxford long enough, which one is the Rose for Emily's house, most people will know which one to point you to. But it's kind of neat that that has some, I don't know, basis in history. I don't know if he based Emily on any particular person or story, but he did base the house that she lived in on a very real house, and you can still see that, which kind of leads us into our next part of this, because I mentioned we're talking preserved corpses, which are a mainstay of horror literature and horror films. But they also have a very real basis in history, and they've been in the news quite a bit lately. Mel, I know you had done a little bit of research into this and had found quite a few examples of these kind of preserved corpses or mummified bodies that are circulating around the news right now.
Yeah. One of the ones that kind of got me thinking about this was a situation that happened. Let's see. So this body was discovered in 2016 in San Francisco, and then the body was identified in 2017. So relatively near to today. So in May of 2016, a body of a child that was buried approximately 145 years ago was found perfectly preserved in a small box under a home in San Francisco. So apparently this home was built on top of a cemetery, and they had moved they had thought they had moved all of the graves to a new location, but apparently they left this one behind. So it was a child who I think was between 2 and 3 years of age, like 2 years and 10 months or something to that effect. And she was almost like perfectly preserved in this casket. Unfortunately, the construction crew that found it did open the casket, but she was not immediately, but she was frozen, refrigerated in order to continue that preservation. But of course, it's not going to be like it was when they found her. But listeners, if you're interested, you can look up articles on this. There's a couple local San Francisco news outlets that did pieces on it. Inside Edition had an article on it, and there are pictures that were taken where, I mean, it just looks like a little girl, like asleep in this box. Her hair is plaited with lavender, and she has flowers for a cross on her chest. And it just kind of just looks like she's lying there. And of course, she's unidentified. So the homeowner ended up being responsible for taking care of this. And so luckily there's a nonprofit organization, I believe, yeah, it's called Garden of Innocence, where they will take unidentified child remains and make sure they're buried properly. And then there was a follow-up a year later from that, so 2 years ago in 2017, where they had done a bunch of research. So they figured out what the cemetery was. They figured out approximately where she would have been buried in relation to this house. They narrowed it down to two children. They found their descendants, and through DNA testing, they discovered that the girl's name is Edith Howard Cook, and she died on October 13th, 1876. Apparently, she had some sort of infection. Her death was listed as because of being undernourished, but it was because she had been ill for so long. And so because of this DNA test, they realized who one of her descendants was. And by putting all this information together, they were able to have another ceremony for this child, only with her actual, history, like her name and pretty much precise age and information. So I thought it was interesting. I mean, obviously, we think of like mummies in the past. We think of, famous people who have their remains preserved. But this idea of just these regular people doing some construction on their house, stumbling upon this, not just like remains, but these perfectly preserved remains was just, I don't know, a colleague of mine at the time where I was teaching last sent it to me to kind of call my attention to it. And it was really, really interesting. Oh, and I think I sent it on to you, Lisa, which is kind of how we got this idea for this episode. Yeah, the pictures are just so intriguing, like just seeing this little child almost like sleeping there. This, I don't know, like disturbing, I guess, aspect to it is the word I'm looking for. Not only that this is a dead body that they found, but also that there's this huge mystery as to who this person is.
Have either of you ever seen like a mummy in real life?
Um, I, I did the travel. I went to that traveling show that went to different museums about mummies a couple years ago, and they had a couple example bodies that you could look at under glass.
Cool. Yeah, I was just curious. I saw one years ago when I was in Mexico. Um, Went to a museum and they had it was a Mayan mummy. I don't know if it was a woman, and I don't know if she was preserved intentionally or just accidentally through whatever process, because it's probably been 15 years since then. But yeah, it was a weird experience. I mean, I don't know if you were just like slightly creeped out and a little uncomfortable, but that's kind of how I felt, because I'm like, here's this person who was alive, who's dead, who still looks very alive, but is obviously not, like, I don't know, like it hit right in the uncanny valley for me, amongst other things. That and just being a little bit morbid.
Yeah, the mummies that I saw weren't as well preserved as like the picture of this girl. They were well, a couple of them had been kept in a dry, kind of arid place, so you could tell they were people. You could tell with skin, but they were kind of like they didn't look precisely as they were when they died. And then there were a couple people who had been mummified in peat bogs, and so you can tell it's a person, but because of like all the marshland around them, like it's not as like a perfect, rendering of what they would have looked like.
Oh yeah, that would have been, yeah. You need a more arid climate, I guess, for like the real preservation, like the Egyptian mummies and whatnot.
Yeah, like a really well-made crypt or something, or like a desert climate. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was just curious. Ever since we came up with this topic, I've been wanting to ask both of you, like, have you seen one? Because like they're creepy. What about you, Lisa? Have you ever?
Yeah, I mean, thinking about it, I feel like there are two instances that I've seen them, and one is, Mel, like you were talking about. It was like a traveling museum um, exhibit, I guess, and those were more of your traditional mummies. Um, so I don't know, they did not creep me out too much. And a lot of those were like kind of, oh, here's an Egyptian king you've never heard of, or a pharaoh. Here's an Egyptian pharaoh you've never heard of, but we have his mummified body. And so I saw that, but a lot of it was more of just stuff that they were buried with, and I don't know. I there seems to be a trend of taking famous people, whether it's a pharaoh or whatever, and preserving their bodies after death. Different cultures have done that with their leaders. And even today, we kind of culturally do that because I've mentioned before, I really love Disney. And one of the things that's kind of an ongoing rumor is that Walt Disney's head has been like cryogenically frozen and it's somewhere underground. Just because there seems to be like a cultural obsession with people that we admire and that we idolize and wanting to keep them alive after death, at least in some way. And I feel like it's kind of the same way with a lot of these museum type mummies I've seen. But then the other instance is I lived in Europe for a while when I was in university. I did a study abroad program. And so I got to travel a lot of places in Europe. And a lot of the Catholic churches have mummified body parts that are, I guess they're relics from different saints. But that to me, Matt, you were talking about just how creepy it is. That to me was the worst of the worst, I think, because number one, you're not even really seeing a whole body usually. And you're in this really just kind of gorgeous church or cathedral or chapel or whatever, but something that's just this like glorious architecture and wonderful. You're surrounded by this artwork and then you're just kind of walking, and they don't always let you know what you're seeing. So you might be looking at some beautiful like stained glass window, and then you take a step to the side and there's a tiny glass case that has a hand in it. you know? And that to me was always talking about just creepy and unsettling. I didn't like it. That was the one thing where I was like, okay, I can look at these Egyptian kind of mummified bodies all day long, but show me, a disembodied hand that is supposed to be, a saint that is sitting in a church. I could not deal with that. I did not like it at all.
Oh, well, Lisa, I know that the Walt Disney cryogenically frozen head is a nice urban legend that I think has been pretty well debunked. But since you mentioned it, and since we are talking about preserved bodies, not necessarily just mummies, I did want to mention the great baseball legend Ted Williams. When he died in 2002, he had his body cryogenically frozen, and he actually it wasn't just that he was cryogenically frozen. They separated the head from the body, and they're stored in two separate containers. So Walt Disney may not have a frozen head, but Ted Williams does, and his head was I believe they called it neuroseparation is the process that the company did in like severing his head and storing it separately, both of which are steel containers in liquid nitrogen. So there you go.
So when they bring you back, like, do they have to sew the head back on? Like, how does that work?
That's the part that I'm not really clear on. But I think that's the sort of thing that Futurama was poking fun at with their various 20th century figures' heads in jars. even though Futurama debuted before 2002, I think the idea of having your head frozen had been around culturally for a while. So, but I honestly don't know what the in-game plan there is. Like, I could understand if your entire body was frozen, maybe there'd be a way to combat the cell death, 500 years in the future or something. But with the head separated from the body, I don't know. Apparently the process was like $130 some odd thousand too. So,
Wow.
Yeah.
As you're talking, we kind of, I don't know, it strikes me as how many different reasons we have, we being kind of, I guess, a broad stroke of humanity, for kind of preserving corpses, because in some cases it is a preservation for the hope of an afterlife, as in like the cryogenically frozen ones. There's always that rumor that, well, we're hoping that we can figure out a way to bring this person back. So even if it's a few hundred years in the future, so it becomes like a preservation thing. And I think, and I don't know, I'm not an ancient Egyptian scholar, but I think that was a lot of it with the pharaohs and things too, is that if they could kind of preserve their bodies, because they were supposed to return as gods pretty much, and so you were preserving them for the afterlife, and that's why their tombs had so much gold and wealth in there, because that's what they were going to need. And so there's that aspect of it, and then there's the aspect of almost like a worship, whether it's a celebrity worship or a saint worship, like in the examples of the relics in these Catholic churches. But I keep going back, Mel, to that first one you were talking about, the preserved child found in the glass coffin. Because in doing the research, we had come across another one of these, I guess, embalmed children. And this one was in Italy, and she was I think like 2 years old when she died of pneumonia, and she was buried in 1920. But apparently the story is, and her name is Rosalia Lombardo, so you guys can look it up. But it's very similar to the story that you were talking about, Mel, in that when you look, she was so, I guess, perfectly preserved. But she was put in a glass coffin in one of the catacombs in Sicily. And that's where they found her, and they were able to identify her. But in both of those cases, I guess just this idea of like a glass coffin and a child. And I think you can really see the grief process going through that, because that's something that's very different from some of these other ones that we're talking about. And a lot of the preserved corpses and mummies that we found too were accidentally preserved. They were found in very cold climates, or where the atmosphere was just perfect for kind of naturally preserving the body. But in this case, it seems that it was a very deliberate burial so that the body would be preserved. And that's just something that is very heartbreaking when you think about, just the idea of being so grief stricken that you need to keep the body around with you as long as you can. And the idea of a glass coffin too, of being able to see into it. It does kind of go back to the idea of like A Rose for Emily. And you talked about the first corpse in that story was her father, and how she was so reluctant to give that up. Because part of that grieving process is really letting go. And that's something that I think a lot of people don't want to do when they're grieving a loved one. I don't know. I mean, that's just these glass coffin children, and the fact that there are more than one of them. I don't know. It's both fascinating to me and heartbreaking at the same time.
Yeah, I think it does have a lot, like you were saying. I mean, it has a lot to do with grief and the issues of letting go. I mean, it reminded me when I was reading about both of the little girls. It reminded me a little bit of the 19th century phenomenon, 19th and early 20th century phenomenon of death pictures, of taking photographs of people when they die in order to have some way to like hang on to that picture of them. Like just looking at the Rosalia Lombardo picture, that was one of the first things that popped into my mind is this idea of like trying to hang on to a memory of that person through a photograph. If you're not going to have many photographs taken of yourself over the course of your life, one of those important moments might be your death. And that's a way that when your body's taken away, your family can hang on to something in a photo album that you were there. And I wonder if it's like a similar motivation for these glass topped coffins and doing the embalming process so that the person is that perfectly preserved.
Yeah, I mean, I had not considered that, but you're right. There is a connection to those death photographs, but still, there's a I don't know. There's just something different about having like a photograph or a painting versus having the actual body there with you. Because that brings up, because it does go into, you can call it dipping its toe into the uncanny valley, which it certainly does. Um, but also it does cross into, I mean, like a rose for Emily, there's a certain point where you're just like, okay, that went too far. We maybe can feel sorry for Emily as she is so distraught over her father she can't let go of the body for a few days. We can feel for her, but that's very different than living with a dead body for decades.
Right.
Which brings up shades of things, and we might as well move this into the fictional realm. But that brings up shades of movies like Psycho. We'll mention that one. House of Wax. I think we need to discuss that one. And by the way, when we talk about House of Wax, I'm talking about the Vincent Price one from the 50s, not the one where Paris Hilton gets
I was
killed.
just about to ask you about the Paris Hilton star vehicle and why you were bringing it up.
I don't know. How do you guys think this functions when it moves into like you move from kind of the real world, there was a grieving family who was trying to work through what they were dealing with, to let's go full on horror in the fictional world?
Well, I think it's another way, in a more extreme way, of dealing with the kind of psychological issues around grief and mourning. And I'm thinking like pop psychological because, I mean, while Psycho might have been based on psychology of the time, it's a work of fiction. And I think you can use some kind of psychological. I mean, the Vincent Price character in House of Wax had issues before he had his horrible accident. But going back to a little bit what you were saying about hanging on to the body too long, Lisa, I was thinking about all the stuff I've read about like the theory of hauntings. When I was like when I do academic work on that, and one of the ideas that pops up over and over again is this idea of like quote unquote improper mourning. Now, people all mourn in different ways, but this idea of like hanging on to something so much that you almost like let it possess you, like not moving past the stage of letting go. And I think a lot of horror, I mean, horror in some ways comes down to mourning and grief. And I think Psycho or House of Wax or Rose for Emily or these sorts of things take our real life issues with how to mourn and just make them extreme, make them extreme and make them disturbing. Yeah, it's just taking it like to the next level in a way.
I'm so glad you said that. That was such a like succinct but like profound thing about how so much of horror is about how we mourn. And because I was even thinking as you were talking that this may not qualify for preserved corpses, but in that same category, something we talked about in a very recent episode of Creepy Children was Pet Cemetery, which is yet another example of improper mourning. But yeah, I mean, I think death is that ultimate human condition, and I mean, it's one of those inevitable facts that we will all die, and people that we know during our lifetime will die, and how we process that grief and how we mourn and how we learn to live with that loss is a very human thing. And I mean, that's what really good horror does, is play on our human emotions or our human or aspects of our humanity in ways that really unsettle us. And I definitely would say that using like Norman Bates's mother in Psycho, for example, as this thing that could not be let go by Norman, probably because of how overbearing she was and how much she inserted herself into his life. But the fact that he wasn't able to let her go even in death, yeah, I mean, I don't know where that sentence was going, but it's a wonderful aspect of horror, I guess, that makes you think about such things.
Yeah, I mean, I keep returning to this idea, and I would love to explore it in future episodes of really kind of the undercurrent of almost all horror is grief, and how people respond to it in different ways. And Matt, I'm glad you brought up Pet Sematary, and I like the idea that kind of use the phrase of improper mourning, or mourning that's kind of broken, that's not working the way it should, or grief that is not working in the way it should, which certainly fits, and I do think it does fit with Psycho and Norman's relationship with his mother, because just as you mentioned, he has kind of a broken relationship with his mother in life. It's only natural that that's going to continue on beyond death, right? And yeah, it just that fits really well, because it's just when you have grief, and I apologize if this is not coming out succinctly, because this just came into my head and I'm trying to work through this thesis as I'm talking to you guys. But you really have kind of, I think, two types of grief in horror. You have the grieving of a relationship that was broken in life. Therefore, it's going to be broken in death too. If it didn't work in life, it's not going to work in death. And so it works with this. I also thought, and I hope I'm not giving any spoilers with this, but there is, the Stephen King trilogy, which started with Mr. Mercedes. I don't know if you guys have watched the television show that's based upon it. But there's a very similar relationship with and I won't give too many spoilers, but with the villain of that storyline, and it's played up more, I think, in the TV series. It's really well done. I highly recommend it if you guys have not seen the Mr. Mercedes. I think it's had 2 seasons now. But he has a very broken relationship with his mother, and in kind of a Norman Bates way. That you can tell that they're kind of playing on what Psycho built before it. But also the grief of losing his younger brother at a young age. And in some way, I think he feels guilty for it. But because of that, the way that he deals with that grief is very, very much broken. And like I said, I don't want to give too many spoilers, because that is a newer story. I'm fine ruining Faulkner stories for you guys, because you should have read them by now. But I don't want to ruin anything that you might not have seen yet, so I won't go into too much detail. But there does tend to be that one where if it was a broken relationship in life, it's probably broken in death too. Or the case of Matt, as you said, death is inevitable in this life, and it's something we all have to deal with. But when death happens too soon, and often you see it with young children, as in Pet Sematary, I think that's when the grief process gets broken as well. And I can see that in a lot. I mean, we mentioned like the movie. We've talked about the book and the movie, The Little Stranger, before in previous episodes, and that kind of, I think, has shades of that. Because you have a child who died young, and almost any time a child dies young, you feel like it's leading up to that, of some sort of haunting, because grief is not happening properly.
Yeah, and in that one, the mother totally like, she takes in the child in a weird way, the haunting of the child, like like the term introjection, but kind of like how Norman turns and takes in his mom and becomes her, and how Emily, her improper grieving. There's a lot of similarities in there, and I think also isolation too, because Emily's isolated, loses her father, even though he's horrible. She still hangs on to him. Norman's mother is terrible, but he's so isolated, he hangs on to her, and it twists him. And in The Little Stranger, that family is also isolated, so that loss of that child means like something different, or something a different haunting for each one, depending upon the relationship they had or their lack of contact with the world outside the house.
Well, yeah, and I think you're right in that each of these, and I love that idea too of grief and isolation and how that does not work. um, because when you have kind of the perfect storm of somebody who's isolated, somebody who is in a diminished mental state because of grief, and grief I think will do that to almost anybody. Um, and then and you couple that with the isolation. Because I feel like that's the first thing people will tell you is that you don't need to go through those things alone. That you often get these kind of haunting stories. Or in the case of Psycho, you get Mother, who is, of course, there's that great image, the great cinematic image of her sitting there as a mummified corpse, as Norman has literally taken her on, running around in the clothes and the wig, because of course a corpse can't talk back, so he's gonna have to play both parts. Um, so yeah, that works well. I do kind of want to talk, and not that we could talk about Psycho for a very long time, and I don't want to move past it too quickly, but I really do want to talk about this Vincent Price 1953 House of Wax movie. Um, if you guys haven't seen it, you need to. And I think what I love about this so much is it's not, it doesn't fit really, I don't think, into this idea of grief that I think we've been running through this idea that I really like. But it does play into the idea, I think, of the uncanny, and that aspect of it, because of course what is happening in House of Wax is you have the wonderful Vincent Price playing an artist, who is this wonderful sculptor, and he has his own wax museum, where he has these historical figures, Marie Antoinette and Joan of Arc. I think there's a Abraham Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth, that he has. And he says he doesn't do all the macabre ones, but he kind of does, because he likes the historical crime aspect of it. And so he has this wax museum, which we have not even talked about, but those creep me out almost as bad as seeing like actual mummies. I don't like them. There's something strange about seeing the likeness of a person, usually a celebrity that but just completely lifeless. It just, I don't like it. But anyway, I went to Madame Tussauds once in London and never again. I did not like it at all. But this is what basically Vincent Price has going on, and he will find these beautiful women and have them model for him, basically. And of course, as you can imagine, these women who model for him meet untimely deaths. One of them, she dies very kind of violently. There's a mysterious killer on the loose, and he kills her. Her body disappears from the morgue, just about the same time that this wax figure based on her goes up. And you can probably see where this story is going. And of course, Vincent Price turns out to be the ones dipping the women into wax and literally using their bodies, preserving their bodies under wax. It's a great, great movie. Mel, I know you watched it recently.
Yeah, I watched it over the weekend, and yeah, I enjoyed it. It's a Vincent Price that I had not seen up to that point, or if I had seen it, it was a long time ago. Um, and yeah, I thought it did that uncanny aspect of wax figures so well. It's those moments when the friend of the woman who has been dipped in wax in order to make Joan of Arc, when she sees this woman and is like, oh my gosh, that looks like my friend, she goes back to the museum multiple times and is trying to touch it and feel the skin because she just can't believe it's wax. And the way the movie renders the wax figures, sometimes with real people and sometimes with wax figures, either way, there's this creepy realness to it that I think I totally plays up that idea of like, well, why wax figures are so creepy. It's like the mannequin in the store that when it gets dark at night can move around, right? It's it's the thing that looks so much like us but isn't supposed to be us. And I don't know, I think in some ways the movie is playing through his bizarre mental issues that are making him do this, playing with this idea of like art maybe being immortal. Like it doesn't matter if he kills these women, it's all about his art, right? And because he's lost the use of his hands and can't make the art himself, he'll just kill people because the ends justify the means. It reminded me of the kind of Nathaniel Hawthorne debates in his stories about like art versus life, and where does one end and the other begin, and how much does one owe to the other. And House of Wax is kind of like his art is more important to him than anything else, even if in order to make it look lifelike, it has to actually be that way. So I thought that was a really interesting extreme, not quite like Psycho, but again, like that kind of strange obsession with something that causes you to hang on a little bit too tight or to do something extreme in order to keep it going.
Right. Well, and the true horror, and you kind of mentioned this about the friend who is going to become one of the final victims, I guess, or she's going to be his Marie Antoinette. You know, that's kind of leading up to the climax of the movie. But when she does, she's grieving her friend, and she sees her as Joan of Arc um, in the wax museum, and that's a really, I mean, when you think about it, that's a really troubling scene, and I think that's part of the reason. Not just when we circle back to what we were talking about at the beginning, but these idea of these real life preserved corpses and how they are kind of uncanny. In the same way, you know, dolls and robots and all those things are mannequins you mentioned. But I have a hard time with them because you realize that a lot of them are there because family members are grieving, but also how horrific that must be to see that. You know, to see your loved one there completely lifeless. Even in those death photography pictures that you were talking about, Mel, those are very disturbing to look at. Mm-hmm. And you understand the motivation behind it, but it's still troublesome. And I think that is one of the things. And again, the movie, because it's a Vincent Price movie, it doesn't spend too much time on it. But just that, to me, that's one of the true horrors, is when the girl sees her friends, well, what is really her friend, but what she thinks is the wax figure, and how troublesome that must be, to be, you know, just going about your life and grieving your friend, and then suddenly seeing your friend's lifeless form standing there. I don't know, that must open the wounds of grief just over and over again. I don't know. That was really horrific for me. That was one of the things that stood out to me about the movie. But then again, it's a Vincent Price movie, so there's also a lot of kind of tongue-in-cheek jokes and, you know, melodramatic moments that play really well. So I don't know. Yeah. It's a very different movie from Psycho, even though they were only what 6-7 years apart, and when they were released. But I think if you're talking preserved corpses and in horror movies, those are the two I would go to.
Oh yeah, I mean House of Wax, that is a preserved corpse, right? I mean, you lay the person out and you pour wax over them.
And it's put up there for people to see, right? And I will mention, I mean, I guess the remake has its merits. I don't know. I had such a hard time watching that movie because I was attached to the Vincent Price one. But I mean that does play up on the same kind of horrors of actually preserving a body, for art's sake, I guess.
It also plays with public and private, right? Because he's making public in his wax museum private moments of grief and violence.
Absolutely.
And, I mean, that goes back to you talking about what you were talking about with the opening of the wound. Like, it's just, I don't know. In some ways, Price's character in that is a Dr. Frankenstein, right? But he's using wax to make his creations, and he has no empathy, and he's not paying attention to how it affects other people. And in some ways, that's kind of a true monster.
Absolutely. Now I'm just kind of hoping Matt will chime in and tell us about Paris Hilton in the newest House of Wax. But
I haven't seen it. I specifically did not watch that movie. I had a friend who saw it, and I think she dies within like 10 minutes, so that's good. But like, no, I specifically stayed away.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay, well, I think that with that discussion of that brief discussion of Paris Hilton might be a perfect place for us to end here. Listeners, we hope you have enjoyed hearing us talk about preserved corpses. I guess it's odd to say we hope you enjoyed us talking about preserved corpses, but it's a very fascinating topic that we had talked about for a while and we weren't sure if we could make a full series out of it. So I could see us maybe revisiting one of these movies, maybe revisiting in a future series. So if there were things that you wanted us to talk about with Psycho or House of Wax that we didn't get to, I'm sure we may in the future. Or if there are things we didn't talk about in Psycho or House of Wax and you would like to tell us your thoughts or ask us any questions or chime in the discussion, we are on social media at NoFearCast, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. We have an email, nofearcast@gmail.com. You can contact us with any comments, questions. We will respond happily. And we very much appreciate all the listeners that we have. If you don't want to engage with us on social media or via email, please tell a friend. If you enjoy this podcast and you think they will, please share. And as always, thank you for listening.